Thanks for having me. Hi, everybody. So I'm about to put the source sheet in the chat, and then can we also screen share that? I don't think I have host. Okay, great. And as I share that, I'm going to give you a little intro, which is one of the things that came up this week that I was noticing in my own Daf Yomi study is how much we were talking about people who are enslaved. And in particular, that's coming up a lot around the ways that slavery is different from marriage in the rabbinic system. And I think it's very, very easy to say, okay, 2000 years ago, there was this stratum of people who had a lower class status and were not treated as well. And that included people who were enslaved and women and possibly a bunch of other people. And so for the rabbis, it kind of makes sense to connect slavery and to connect divorce or questions of marriage and agency and freedom, which is really what Gittin and its conversations of divorce are about. And there's been a lot of really interesting work by modern scholars to talk about the places where the Talmud compares, especially women and slaves. And so we're going to look at a little piece from a modern responsum that does that. So it's a modern rabbinic text talking about women's current status in Jewish community. I'm going to give you a little bit more of an intro when we get there. And then we're going to look at a few excerpts from this week that ask the question, in what ways are marriage and slavery similar, and in what ways are they different? And I want to emphasize, it's not as much about the relationship, right? What's the relationship between a married couple or a person who owns another person and a person who is owned? But it's about what are the legal structures that are similar and different, and what do those tell us about what the rabbis are thinking about the nature of these relationships? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and screen share. Give me 1 second to push the buttons. I'm also going to okay, so I've now put twice in the chat. You can see the doc, and I am going to do the screen share. Give me 1 second. Okay. Great. Okay. So the first text I brought here is, you might notice, from 2014 and not from the Talmud. And I'm bringing this as an example of the ways in which modern scholars, particularly modern rabbis who are engaged in the Jewish legal system in halacha and trying to understand in what ways might women's status today in Jewish law be different than women's status 2000 years ago, and how that draws on this rabbinic comparison between slavery and between really slaves and women as people who are sort of on a parallel social level. So this is from a CJLS, that's the Conservative Movement's Rabbinic Law Council. It's a responsum. It's attempting to lay out a vision of what the world should be like around women's obligation in mitzvot in a framework where Jewish men have obligation in mitzvot as well. So it's in a framework where everyone has to do mitzvot. And then we say, who is the everyone, actually? And I would love to hear a voice that isn't mine. So if there's a volunteer who would want to read this out, please press the hand raising button. Because of the screen share, I won't be able to see you otherwise. Great. Stephen, please. Thank you.
It is essential to highlight that the exemption of women from the mitzvah of the study of Torah is not about gender. Slaves were exempted from this mitzvah as well, citing Ketubot 28a. Women and slaves were both exempted because of their place in the social hierarchy. Were subordinate, and as those were not full members of Jewish society, they were not expected to exercise and excluded from full citizenship in the central activity of Jewish life, the interpretation of teaching of Torah, and the location of the rabbinic study of Torah, the Beit Midrash.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Stephen. So the specific local example that Ari Varmesh is talking about is the obligation to study Torah, which is what we're all doing right now. But her broader claim is that women and slaves share this, what she's calling not full members of Jewish society. And because they're subordinate, they're not as central, they're not included in the main activities of Jewish communal life, here represented by Torah learning. What do you make of this claim? Do you think that it's true? Based on whatever past experience you have, your experience of your current Jewish life, your experience of rabbinic texts, do you buy it? Do you think that women share a social status with slaves in the rabbinic project because of their lower social status and not something inherent that we might say is about gender or something else? Yeah, Janine.
I remember growing up, and my parents, who I don't know that they were tremendously educated in all of this, said that it was because the women had other things to do, more important things to do, like taking care of the household and taking care of the children. And it wasn't an insult. It was an acknowledgement of this. And though I really think they were just kind of protecting me from something, that's still what's in my head.
Yeah. So there's a lot. What you're hitting on is there are so many through the centuries, right? Many people have asked this question of why are women in traditional rabbinic texts given a different set of obligations? And what I hear you saying is kind of this, there's this two layers that I'm hearing, or maybe I'm hearing it because that's also how I feel, which is that on one hand, if women are supposed to be carrying this burden, this extra burden of care for children, for the household, doing this really holy and important care work, which even today in our own world is so undervalued, right? That to say, also you have this full set of obligations, maybe that would be unkind or not accounting for the kind of extra unfair social burdens that are already on women.
But it wouldn't.
If go to Torah study are important, then what are we doing by saying women shouldn't be doing that? That's actually really messed up and that's apologetic at best. It's exclusionary.
But I think my parents were telling me that they could do it if they had the time. They could do it. So it wasn't that they were forbidden from doing it. It was that they could do it. And of course, at some point, I realized that wasn't true. So.
Yeah. And especially in the ways we inherit these different frameworks in our own Jewish lives, we get them through the filters of other people who are trying to help us have a strong relationship with Judaism. And I think that also gets at how charitably do we want to read the rabbis? How much are we predisposed to say, I trust that they want the best for us, even if they weren't in our social world? And how much are we saying, this is 2,000 years old and I'm going to read it with a little bit of skepticism? Yeah. Hedda, and then I see Claudette also. Hedda, are you there? I see your hand up. Okay, Claudette.
The thing about this is that I have to take off the lens of a modern day person and look at this with the lens of the ancient. And when I look at it at the ends of the ancient, is how the society was set up. The society was set up is that the man who goes out into the marketplace and the woman stayed indoor. The slave also stayed indoor. So I think I have to look at it a little bit different, not with the sensibility of a modern individual. And that is why he is saying this, that women and slave are equated, but really is because they were not in the marketplace.
Yeah, so if we're just speaking historically, right, we're talking about many people who were not in the, what you're saying, marketplace, also just, right, I'm going to generalize that out to public life in a way. And so this is people who are not participating in kind of public-facing, community-central things.
Right.
Okay, I see a lot of hands. I'm very excited about that. I want us to look at some more text, so I hope you'll all forgive me if I move along. I'm also seeing a lot in the chat. Thank you. So one of the claims that Rabbi Barmash makes, so her responsum, which is this piece of Jewish legal writing, is arguing that because women's social status has changed, right? She's writing in 2014, women's obligation in mitzvot tracks with their social status. And so it's different now, right? She might say, okay, in a time where, like you were saying, Claudette, women and people who were enslaved were excluded from the social functions of like the public, that also applied to Jewish community. And now that that's not the case, we should shift that. And I think that's really interesting. I find that very compelling. You don't have to, but I do. And I want to look at a few cases. We might not see all of them. I brought a few that I thought were interesting. Some of them are pretty similar. But a few cases where the Talmud itself kind of tries to compare enslaved people and women and then says, how does that work and not work? And those are mostly technical legal reasons, as we're going to see, and they're about how the rabbis are reading the Bible. But I think they also get at big questions about what is the difference. In what ways does this comparison make sense, and in what ways does the comparison fall apart? Okay. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to do a little sandwich. We're going to look at the first and last of the three texts I brought, and we're going to jump over the middle one, but you have it if you want to look at it later. Okay. So we have this text from Gittin 39a, which, forgive me, I don't have off the top of my head which day of this week it was. But if you're on the Daf Yomi cycle, it was this week. And if you're not, it's in the Torah and it's wonderful. And the Torah is wonderful. So we have this statement. Rav Nachman said that Ula holds as follows. Okay, so we're talking about a person who converts to Judaism and they own another person. So I'm going to say the person who converted, we're going to call him Shimon, and the person who's enslaved, we're going to call him Reuben. And it's saying that, so because someone who converted to Judaism in technical halacha, in Jewish law, has no relatives, that's obviously emotionally not true, but for the purposes of the rabbis, we'll go with it for now and kind of put aside how complicated that is for just the moment. That normally when a person dies and they own other people in the rabbinic system, their heirs inherit those enslaved people. But if a person has converted and has no technical heirs, what do we do? So a slave of a convert is comparable to his wife in this case, just as his wife is freed by his death without a bill of divorce, right? If two people are married and one of them dies, that relationship is over. The wife is no longer accountable to her dead husband in any way. She is freed in that she can marry someone else if she wishes. And she's freed by his death without a bill of divorce. So too, his slaves are freed without a bill of manumission. So normally, when a person is alive, anybody they own as an enslaved person or anyone they're married to those relationships need a document to be severed. In the case of marriage, that's a get. That's the title of our Masechet, right? Gittin means get plural. It's a document of divorce. There are two ways for a marriage to end in rabbinic halacha. One is the death of one of the partners, and the other is a husband giving his wife a get. That obviously creates a lot of problems in the world today. But the same is actually true, and this is actually why Gittin ends up talking so much about enslaved people, is because typically an enslaved person to be freed also needs a document that frees them. And so here we have this statement, and the rest of the Gemara, if you learned it this week, you'll know that I'm bringing you a very selective little chunk. This gets debated, and it's not clear that this is the final word on this matter. But we have that basically we know a true fact about marriage and divorce, and we are mapping it on to enslavement. What do you make of that comparison? That if we know a fact about how divorce works, we can learn about how slavery works. How does that sit with you? Stephen Lamb, I see you have your hand up. Was that responding to this or was that from earlier? Okay, I'm going to assume it was from earlier. I see something in the chat. Okay, Vivian, why can't women give a get? Yeah, it's a huge problem. It's a really big problem. We're going to bracket that for now, but in rabbinic halacha, it's the person with more power gives the get to the person with less power, and that's man to woman. Modern halacha is dealing with that a lot, and it is creating a lot of suffering in the world today, and it is a big problem. Okay, Eva, I see you saying it's weird, but it also implies a level of intimacy and responsibility that we don't normally associate with slaves. Right, that's really interesting, right? I think that so often we say it is so messed up for the rabbis to compare marriage to slavery, in that it implies that a spouse, a wife specifically, right, the lower social status person in a straight marriage, is sort of parallel to being her husband's slave, right? And that's obviously pretty disturbing. And even you're pointing out that actually here the comparison goes the other way. It's saying, how is an enslaved person like a wife? And that, yeah, that could generate this, that's generating this sense of intimacy that I think is really interesting. And Rob, you're saying you prefer to live in a society where documents are used in legal proceedings instead of verbal agreements. Yeah, right. There's something about, right, it's risky here. And that actually comes up a lot in all of the Talmud from this week, that a lack of a document is dangerous if you're moving through the world, right? Later on, we find this concern that in this case, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, there's this concern that then like someone else will try to like re-enslave that person because they don't have sufficient evidence that they were freed. And so there's something very risky about this. Stephen Burke, is your hand up or is your arm just moving? Okay. So I'm going to use our closing 10 minutes. We're going to jump over this other text from 39A. We're moving, 41B. Okay. We are going to get in the weeds a little bit. I'm going to read this to you. It is not essential for our conversation that you understand all of the textual moves the rabbis are making. Okay. So we're talking now about, okay, you've heard of business agreements, right? You've heard of business partnerships. Two people can jointly own like a store. Now we're talking about, can two people jointly own another person? Right? So normally you have the slave and the person who owns the slave. We're talking about there's two people who jointly own an enslaved person. And typically that's going to manifest in they work for one of the owners one day and one of the owners the next day. And so if a person who owns another person frees that person, but the other person who owns that person does not free that person, you have a problem. Okay, I'm going to blast us through this first paragraph. Again, it's a little in the weeds. I'm going to do my best to explain, but if you're not following the whole thing, that is A-okay. So the rabbis derive their opinion that a slave cannot acquire half of his freedom via a bill of manumission, i.e. you can't be half freed from a document. You can only be not freed or totally freed. And from a verbal analogy, this is a classic rabbinic interpretive technique. It's called a gzera shava, where the rabbis say, here's a word in one place in the Torah talking about one case, and the same word appears in a different place talking about a different case. And so we can learn about one of the cases from the other case by sort of doing a little connect the dots between those two identical words. So we have the word her, which is la, which is, in our case, about enslaved people. And we have that same word, la, written about divorce. So just as in the case of a woman, one is not able to divorce half of her with a bill of divorce, right? There's no such thing as saying, here's a get, you're half divorced, right? That's kind of an incomprehensible statement. The rabbis are saying, so too, we learn this from this parallel language. One is not able to emancipate half of a slave with a bill of manumission. However, okay, with regard to a slave who frees himself by giving money, i.e. a slave can kind of buy themselves back, as it were, And I don't want us to naturalize too much the idea of people buying other people. Like, I want to pause. Like, that's bad. So if there's money, however, an enslaved person can free themselves for kind of half the time by buying themselves back. So to summarize that, documents can only free completely and not partially. And we know that because of a verbal analogy from one part of the Torah about divorce to another part of the Torah about slavery. Okay. But maybe that's not, there's a debate. So maybe they disagree about this. So one sage, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, holds that a derivation from a juxtaposition is preferable. Okay. And one sage, i.e. the other team, the whole rest of the rabbis, hold that a verbal analogy is preferable. So they are basically arguing about, I didn't bring you the full text, so you're not seeing all of it, but they are arguing about whether or not, which way of deriving a halachic source is better, from a similar word in two places, or from the fact, what they're calling here in the translation, a juxtaposition, from the fact that one thing is mentioned right next to another thing in the text. Okay, that's in the weeds. Kind of black box that for yourself for now. It's a debate about which textual method is preferable. And then no, it's actually not, says the Gemara. That was a proposal. We're going to reject the proposal that this debate is actually about interpretive strategies. It's actually about the meaning of the thing and not about the interpretive strategy. Okay. So actually, no, there's total consensus. Everyone agrees that generally a verbal analogy is preferable, i.e. any proof text that's coming from this kind of la, one word here, one word there, is going to be authoritative over a different kind of proof text. However, our case is different. Stephen, you just said in the chat, the situations are not similar. That's exactly what the rabbis say. The situations are not similar. Because here, what is unique about a woman is that she cannot leave a marriage via money at all. But so you can't make these comparisons. That actually, even though normally in the rabbinic project, if you have one word here and one word there, and you can connect the dots and apply the laws of one case to another, here, exactly what you said, Stephen, which is marriage and enslavement are not the same. And I think this is really interesting because specifically, even though over the past several pages, the rabbis have been using this tool of comparison, broadly defined, to figure out what the difference is, to figure out things about enslavement based on what they know about marriage. Here, there's a step back. Actually, these cases are different. Okay. What do you make of the rabbis having this moment of like, wait, actually, it can only go so far. These cases are really meaningfully different. Okay, well, I have a theory. I'm going to tell you. I think that reading, especially this piece, through the lens of this discourse of, well, women just have a different social status now, and so can't be compared to enslaved people, and so therefore we are going to make changes in women's status in the Jewish world. I think it often comes out of this sense of there is this totally flat sense in the rabbis, which is, I'm strawmanning this position, but there is a sense of it's all about social status. And when social status changes, our society, our Jewish world needs to change. And I totally buy that. Like, I think that is very compelling. And at the same time, I think that there is a temptation to say, actually, oh, well, women aren't marginalized anymore. We're not going to find any points of common cause. Women are like men now. We're all sort of full citizens is the language that gets used sometimes, right? That's the language Barmash uses. And we say, okay, women are equal now. Done. Easy peasy. Without looking at the ways that even in the Talmud, even within the Gemara, there are questions about are relationships of marriage versus ownership the same? And in what ways are we finding paths to here literal liberation from enslavement in ways that reject comparisons between groups that have been marginalized in society, saying, okay, well, women are just like men now. We're moving women out of the like bad category into the good category. And how do we do that? And acknowledge that, thank God, the really different social reality that people have really fought for without saying kind of, and we're going to leave behind this whole discourse of there are people who are marginalized in our communities and they don't have the same social status. Okay. Yeah, and Marky, I'm going to close with what you said in the chat, which is, it's a shame our ancient Jewish world wasn't more egalitarian. That's so true, but we can work now to make our Jewish world more inclusive. And I think we can, and large parts of it still are not. And there's a lot of work to be done. And hopefully Torah and our Torah study can be a tool towards moving us towards that. All right. Thank you for learning with me. I'm going to stop the screen share.
Thanks, Rabbi Halpern. And thanks everybody for joining us. We'll be back next week at this time. Hope to see you then. Take care, everybody.